Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Climate Policy Institute's event, Nation States Going Green. First of all, let me introduce to you our key speaker, Professor Bert De Vries. He holds a PhD from the University of Groningen, the Netherlands. He wrote his doctoral thesis on sustainable resource use. He's co-founder of the Institute for Energy and Environment at the University of Groningen. He has published extensively in the fields of resource and in particular energy analysis, modeling and policy, climate change and global change modeling, and complex systems modeling of sustainable development. He has been actively involved inter alia modeling and scenario development for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC. Currently, he is the Professor Emeritus of Copernicus Institute for Sustainable Development at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And the theme of the event will discuss, for example, how in the summer of 2023, there were several heat records broken in Western countries. Meanwhile, nation-states are suffering from stagflation. The sights of governments remain focused on energy security and affordability. How can nation-states develop in a sustainable way in this environment? What are the social, environmental, and technological solutions? Can we develop in the short term green future for us? This will be discussed. First of all, let me introduce Professor Bert De Vries.
Thank you, Nico, for the introduction. I will give answers to some extent to the questions which were sent to me. But basically, it's just a collection of thoughts and reflections I will have on this broader issue of nation states going green. So, this is all I will say, almost all I will say about my background, because I got involved in the limits to growth work and debate some 40, almost 50 years ago. And the end of my career, I might say, is a book which is to be published at the end of this year called Sustainability Science, because in the process I gradually, via work on energy modeling and climate modeling, etc., I gradually came to the understanding that we have to deal with sustainable development in a broader, comprehensive way, in which we acknowledge the inherently complex and integrated aspect. So, what it means is that I think it's important to understand, as I said already in a lecture yesterday too, how we got where we are. And to me, it's something which you could address in many ways, but one of them is to talk about modernity. Because modernity is, in a way, the dominant worldview. And we expect, at least that's what I notice very often, that in the end, within a few decades or so, everyone in the world becomes modern in a Western way. And if you look at what historians have collected on information about the gradual evolution of what we call modernity, I think the key elements here are the loop of the population growth, including the demographic transition, the loop of economic growth, which is mainly associated with capitalism, and a number of other items which are dealt with, for example, the important role of the church in promoting literacy, the important role of the gradual development of institutions, and also market institutions and rules, and also the important progress based on science and engineering in the 19th century, especially in Europe, regarding issues of hygiene, sewage, medical services, educational services, etc. So this is the background to modernity as it's usually framed. Now, it's interesting to discuss the question, did modernity bring us real progress? And maybe it's difficult to see from a distance, but here I show you the outcome of a report by some colleagues of mine who collected data on a number of indicators over the past 200 years in 9 regions in the world. And what is interesting to see, and I have to go very fast, but what is interesting to see is that in some countries, especially Eastern Asia, the increase in well-being was much larger than economic income as such. So if you include other variables like life expectancy, income inequality, etc., then in fact the Asians, think also the Chinese, made much more progress than is suggested by the income data in a narrow sense, GDP per person per year. Interestingly, it's mostly the Western offshoots, United States, Australia, and some other places, who show exactly the opposite. Here, you see that GDP per person, that means income, is actually going much faster than progress measured by including all the other variables. And that's, to me, an interesting point for the whole debate about why we actually want economic growth. And if we want economic growth, please let us discuss what that means, what kind of growth. Because if that growth shows a bad performance in terms of income inequality, for instance, or in terms of mean species abundance, you may actually see that you end up here, which means you have high income rise, especially because the world is financializing through the international, mostly Western financial system. But in fact, your real well-being is not increasing anymore or even declining. So this is an interesting question in relation to modernity and the whole aspiration for economic growth. Of course, in my many discussions with economists, I also pointed out to them the economy operates within an open, self-organizing system called Earth. So it's really, really a mistake to think that you can discuss the economy as if it really is just that system where we exchange money and then we measure how much money per year has been exchanged, and then we say this is income and it should go up. The trouble is, the real system is in fact planet Earth with high exergy energy coming in, with low exergy energy going out. And in the process, over millions of years, you have seen this gradual formation of, for example, fossil fuels and very high exergy dense minerals. So that's the reality where we are in. And we should always, at least I think that's what we should always put our understanding of the economic system in this larger context. And if we don't, then of course we will be confronted with feedbacks. And in fact, the whole benefit of this fairly famous study, Limits to Growth, to the Club of Rome, 1972, is relatively simple. You have this industrial production and service production, which benefit the population. And this is, let's say, a simplification of the system I just sketched as modernity. Now, all they did is add a few elements, namely agriculture, which is one of the sectors which are most closely interacting with Earth. They also included natural resources depletion and environmental degradation. And then they said, well, we never know, of course, what will happen, But if we parameterize this model, which was in the early ages of computer modeling, then we see that we can reproduce a number of key variables for the world at large. So you see here the population, you see non-renewable resources, you see food, etc. And then they said in the early first book, Limits to Growth, that the business as usual future looks like this. Now, of course, this is great stuff. It was quite a success globally, especially, for instance, in my relatively overpopulated country of the Netherlands. And I always told my students that then on the 3rd of August 2026, we will see the start of the collapse. And I always hope that students understood that I said this to eliminate any illusion of accuracy in this kind of forward calculation. So the question is, of course, having this scenario, business as usual, you may wonder, did we learn anything from these simulations? And what is the comparison with reality? And recently, someone from a consulting firm, Harrington, did the same as Dennis Meadows did 15 years ago, which is comparing the simulation with the real-world data. And the conclusion basically is, as I say here, the historical trends are mostly in line with 2 of the 4 scenarios which they published. Namely, on the one hand, the scenario in which you have more resources than they originally estimated. So you might have said they were underestimating the amount of resources. And the other scenario called comprehensive technology, which suggests that they were actually, in the business usual scenario, underestimating the success of technology. What it also shows is that the 2 extreme scenarios in Limits to Growth have very low plausibility. In fact, the real collapse, as I showed you before, nobody believes that this is happening. And also the other scenario, sustainability, in which you really start to slow down or even bring to a halt the growth of population and economy, also will not be realistic. So it's interesting to see that in retrospective, we have 2 scenarios which precisely indicate the themes of the moment in the discourse. Namely, do we have enough resources to the kind of growth aspirations we have? And secondly, if we have those resources, are we then able to create and manage the technologies needed to exploit them and to deal somehow with all the environmental impacts which they create? Okay, so since then we have made many, many models. So I've been involved in a large global change project in the 90s. We also developed the model image, which is still being used within the IPCC. It means that you start making bigger and bigger models. I have personally my doubt about these global change models. I think even the people who make the models are no longer really understanding what's happening. In that sense, it's a little bit similar to artificial intelligence. Nevertheless, we make scenarios, and fairly recent scenarios by my colleagues, Van Vuren, Riai, and others, show, for example, that the IPCC now envisages this kind of futures. The left one is the growth of the population. So you see population may go, small chance, to 15 billion, but it may also go to maybe 7 billion. And of course, the highest probability, according to the UN these days, is between 10 and 12 billion people by 2100. Now, if you then do the simulations with the various economic and energy models we have in these global change models, you see that you can feed them with economic projections. As you can see, the projections range from something like 5 times present global world production to 20, 30 times global world production. and the middle, again, is most realistic. An interesting question is, how do these relate to the IPCC scenarios? And you see here that this scenario, the green line, is a very optimistic line about slowdown of population growth and bringing it back. At the same time, these people are very green in their growth. So this is a GDP which is not only relatively modest, but also very green. So this is a beautiful future. It's called SSP3, Social Path 3. You also have a world in which we will live in this scenario with 13 billion people. They have a much higher economic growth, but nevertheless, per person, they are poorer. So actually, this is the green world, not many people, and many of them doing quite well. This is a world here, with many people in relative poverty. Now, what we then said, especially the people at the ASA and other places who do this, is can we then give an idea about the emissions? And then you see that emissions in this beautiful green world would even go below zero, and in this somewhat more dramatic, not to say collapse world of SSP3, they would be twice as much as today. This is the state of the art now in, let's say, IPCC-related modeling of population, economic activity, and subsequent emissions. Now, the question is, of course, do we understand what it means if we have such a high CO2 emission in the future? The reality is, in my view, that many of our climate models have very high uncertainties related to cloud formation, related to a number of larger scale climate phenomena, etc. Nevertheless, what we do know is that greenhouse gases do play a role in warming up the planet. And we also know, whether we do it in greenhouse gas equivalent or just in CO2, that you have this graph, which I consider one of the more interesting ones in the recent IPCC report. Here you see the cumulative CO2 emissions, and here you see the increase in average temperature predicted by a range of climate models. And you see that in the past 100 years or so, we emitted this amount of cumulative carbon, and all the models suggest that if we go on with emitting carbon, then we simply are on an almost linear trajectory in terms of the rise in temperature. And the consequence of this is relatively simple. If you want to stay below a certain temperature level, it means that you cannot use all the carbon we know exists in Earth. We cannot use all the coal, all the oil, and all the gas, because if we do so, we will have cumulative emissions which exceed this level, and then you may expect, according to all the models, that you will see a significant rise in temperature. So I think this is basically the state of the art with respect now only to climate change, which is only one part of the real challenge of sustainable development. Recently, there was a book by a number of people, including Jürgen Randers, who also was part of the Limits to Growth team, and they wrote this book, Earth for All. You can download it on the internet. It was published last year. And what they say is, I'll go very fast, but what they say is basically this. It is possible to give billions of people a good quality of life in the 21st century, but it requires deep transformative policies. This will be no surprise for most of you, but in the book they go fairly detailed into the kind of changes and policies which are necessary. And they include, for example, very unlike the limits to growth model, an inequality index and a social tension index, which shows already that this new exercise has much more awareness about the social side of the whole problem, which was not the case in limits to growth. And maybe also interesting, unlike previous reports to the Club of Rome, this report is very explicit in its political economic analysis. The title of the last chapter is From Winner-Take-All Capitalism to Earth for All Economies. And I think that's a title which suggests already what is really meant to some extent with those deep transformative policies. Now, having said this, what does this mean for small nation states and their quest for sustainable development? And obviously you have all kinds of local effects. This is just one graph which shows a local effect. And what does this mean? In my view, it means that we are to prepare for more complexity, which is already there, and more uncertainty. And why? Well, we have several globalization waves, but the globalization wave since the 1990s has been very intense. It has also deeply influenced our financial system, especially because of the deregulation, which was already started up in the 80s. We had an ICT revolution, which means that now many people in the world can on their phones see how other people are actually very rich and I am not. So shall I migrate, for instance? And finally, as many of my colleagues suggest, also social scientists, archaeologists, etc., in the longer term perspective, we have to prepare for the fact that we may be or may experience the end of Holocene climate stability, because the last 8 to 10,000 years were, from a climate perspective, relatively stable, and according to quite some climate scientists, this may change. So I'll go fast here. Among the counter forces, I can already see, and this goes to the question what a nation state could do. I see important counter forces that there is more support for protectionism, and there is more attention for a new role for the state, and also different, broader perception of public space and commons. And there are a number of ways to discuss this. I think there's also more openness and more focus on bottom-up citizen initiatives. That's what I noticed certainly the last 5 to 10 years, initiatives by NGOs, CSOs, etc. There is also clearly an emergence of alternative paradigms. Among them are much more interest and research on common pool resources. Some of you may know the work by Elinor Ostrom, who actually very amazingly not only was the first woman to get a Nobel Prize in economics, but also on a topic which was considered until 10 years ago as completely outside economic science. So those are, to me, very promising signs that our paradigms, including our view of nature and our relation with nature, are changing. Yes, yeah, I think we should engage with simulation games. We should explore degrowth, beyond growth, like work by Mariana Mazzucato and Tim Jackson. Now, I will, well, just the last minute. You know, I made, with colleagues, a system dynamics scheme of the dynamics in the global food system. And I cannot go in any detail here, but it's interesting that if you look at the food system, the corporations tend to present the food system as a somewhat uniform, increasingly globalizing system or global system. The reality is that, as a colleague of mine in Amsterdam has been investigating, that we still have very different practices and decision-making rules in agriculture. The world is not yet completely uniform. And we should realize that this is also showing that we have a huge resource of local and regional knowledge and insights which we should be careful about. So the idea of the global food system is also interesting from the perspective of a huge number of farmers then a few number of corporations who rule important parts of the system, and then many, many, many million of consumers. And this gradual concentration of power in the hands of a number of corporations is something which we should certainly discuss as part of the whole debate on climate change. Well, I forget about this, energy transition also, mass also, because you asked me to spend only 20 minutes on a huge topic.
Thank you so much for the fascinating presentation, Professor. And right now, I would like you to introduce the distinguished panel members who will talk about nation states going green. Callum Nicholson is the head of research of Climate Policy Institute. Please welcome. Take a seat. And Mr. Logan West is a research fellow at Danube Institute. Regarding their specific expertise, Callum Nicholson is a cultural anthropologist, and Logan West is a government and security policy expert. And you can see right now on the screen that if you type it in your phone, slido.com, and those numbers, you can write questions to the professors, and they can answer these questions after the panel. Thank you.
Yours, Ted.
So, Professor Vries, you did not have a chance to tell all your things about your presentation, but I'm sure that you will have a chance to include it in your answers to the questions that we will be discussing. So, first of all, I would like to ask, and we will go in order, so Professor Vries, and then Logan, and then Callum will answer. So, as I mentioned, that heat records were broken in Europe, and not just in Europe, America, and across the West. And this is something that is inevitable to be noticed even for policymakers. And how do you see climate, sustainability, and especially energy security decision makers being affected enough by this to see it reflected in their work?
Well, I could go in many directions with this question. I mean, one thing is how we communicate things about climate change. And I told already some people that I'm surprised, in many countries actually, to see on television now storms or floods, which are fairly usual stuff. But now all of a sudden you see them every day on the television. So apparently there is this sense that nowadays you have to communicate something about the weather, especially extreme events. I think we are in that sense exaggerating a little bit the rate and magnitude of what's going on. And you have to emphasize that we have a number of uncertainties which are still with us, including about the models and the estimation and evaluation of the impacts. I think also that the problem with climate, in a sense, is that it's very statistical in nature. I notice that many people have not much understanding of statistics. Statistics means not that next year the summer will be even hotter. No, statistics means that you have a certain probability that next year may be even worse than last year, but you have maybe a higher probability or equal probability that it will be much colder or much less extreme than last year. And dealing with statistics is difficult and often not done very well, in my view, in communication. you're asking, finally, do policymakers do anything with this? Of course, they can abuse or use, depends on your perspective, every storm, every extreme event to push for a certain policy. I told my colleagues, if climate change shows up, and it started to become serious by 2015, 2016, you can absolutely be sure that the nuclear power producers will show up again and will say, you see, we told you, nuclear is the solution. Please start quickly, because it takes 10 years before a plant is finalized. So that's one answer.
Thank you, Professor. Logan, how do you comment on this?
Well, with regards to how policymakers will react, they will, I think to a degree, they will certainly use statistics and science, but what makes a politician react more than anything else in the West is the attitude of their voters. So how much the general public is concerned about the policy is ultimately what will drive policymakers, because nothing will drive a policymaker faster than something they're afraid will get them kicked out of office. With regards to the security angle, after the war in Ukraine started, the second biggest issue was the pipeline of energy from Russia to the rest of Europe. And as the professor commented with regards to nuclear energy, in addition to being green, it was also an energy source that was secure for Germany. And after they had given up their own energy independence, by and large independence, they became reliant on Russia. So climate friendliness and security really do go hand in hand in terms of energy sovereignty, continuity, and having less impact on the environment. Now, one of the biggest issues for Europe going forward will be what partnerships it will strike up. Because if it's learned anything from this recent war, it's that you want to be careful with making energy pacts with countries that you may potentially be in conflict with later on down the road. So the balance they have to strike between that is, to what extent do they use energy relations as a mean to try to lower relations, which is what they hoped to do with the relationship through Russia, but ultimately did not work. And to what degree do they want to maintain their own sovereignty? So as far as what will make politicians react, it is the mentality of their people and what looks good in terms of longevity for security and for environmental concerns.
Thank you. Callum?
Well, first of all, it's interesting, ideas like a climate expert or a climate policymaker or a sustainability policymaker are not something that would really have existed 25 or 30 years ago. Energy decision makers would have been there, but it would have been very much a geopolitical concern framed around nation-state power and so on. It's interesting how increasingly a lot of our problems are being reframed as being almost apolitical, these type of technocratic concerns around climate. And I think this gets at something you were saying about the way that we are giving meaning to the patterns of weather now, that it's worth noting that when we talk about weather, again, 20 years ago, if there was a storm, it would be a human story, but there was not often a broader globalized narrative attached to that storm of saying, this is significance in relation to, say, the climate. And again, it's worth noting something you pointed out, that we often, I think, look at weather and we think of the climate, but weather and climate are not the same thing. As I think you rightly said, climate is a statistical artifact. The IPCC's definition of climate change is a 30-year rolling average, and also global climate change as an average. And the point of that is not to therefore say climate isn't real or it's not happening. It is real and it is happening. But the question of how you go from a concern for an abstraction to a specific policy on the ground is apples and oranges. They're different things. The contingencies of society are very local. The climate may be a globalized abstraction, but we live our life locally in space and time. We live now here, not 30 years everywhere. And I think sometimes it's not that the climate framing is wrong, it's that sometimes I wonder about its utility for actual policymakers on the ground. And to the extent to which policymakers are engaging with it, I often think there's a performativity to that, or a sense that they have to say something because that is the dominant narrative. But there is something else worth, I think, saying about this, is that when we often talk about climate change, I think the thing we're really talking about is societal change. And it's interesting when we talk about climate change, I think sometimes it acts to depoliticize and indeed distance ourselves from both the causes of climate change and the consequences, or how we respond to it. Because at the end of the day, if we accept the idea that climate change is anthropogenic, what we're really talking about are the consequences of societal changes. And if you look at how we react to it, it requires, again, societal types of adaptation. But this kind of brings me to my sort of last point here, which is that in your question it said, what do decision makers do? And I find this an interesting phrase, a very common phrase. What about the decision makers? And it's this idea that's implied in that, if we think about it, that all of our problems in our lives, that there is someone out there, some expert, who will fly in and know the right, stroke their beard, or and write something on their MacBook, and come up with the answer, right? And it's really interesting how we've abstracted decision makings to this sort of secular priesthood. But it's interesting that a lot of, as an example of what I mean, we hear a lot these days about climate change adaptation. Now that is a fancy technocratic bit of jargon for a very simple concept, which has always been there, which is culture. There's a reason why the Swiss have different roofs from people in Croatia. That said, Croatian architecture is changing. But there's a reason why, because culture is adaptive. We forget that life is hazardous. The reason we survive is that we have sedimented decades, centuries, millennia of adaptations. The clothing we wear, the buildings we live in, strip away all of this adaptation, and most of us are dead in 72 hours from exposure, even in hot weather. Culture is adaptive. And it's interesting how we've now had this idea that we've just invented the concept of adaptation in the last 20 years, and you can only learn it if you do an MSc in adaptation studies at LSE. But actually, adaptation is what we've always done. And it's interesting, I think, we often look at the policy making, we think, now we have the policymakers, we're okay. But the fact we think it's only capable through policymakers, I think, is a sign of a much deeper problem and systemic problem in the culture, that we no longer value sedimented culture. So when we talk about, I just wanted to throw it in there, that when we think about decision makers with these issues, it's worth critiquing these ideas. Why do we talk always about decision makers? Why do we always think it has to be an institutional response? Why can't we leave society and people to what we always used to leave them to, which was something that was more, I suppose, suitable to the local circumstance? And the reasons why we don't, of course, are social, nothing to do with climate. It's to do with the standardization of technologies and industrial models for things and capitalism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these types of technologies. But then we got to ask, what's the problem we're facing really? Is it a climatic problem as such, or is it a societal, a historical, a political, a technological, an economic problem? Anyway, thank you.
Thank you for these answers. And we will go on to the next question, which will dive deeper into these topics which you already mentioned, of how culture, ICT, all comes together under the term sustainability, climate change. But Professor Vries has already mentioned some of these terms in his presentation. But as you can see from the view of our experts, they have different backgrounds, but still there is a lot of not just terms, but a lot of meaning behind these, which need more of explaining. So just going back to basics, the sustainable development has obviously 3 elements: economic, environmental, and social. And we are interested in how can social welfare be maintained in the face of a warming planet, if at all that is possible. You mentioned the problems with ICT regulation, which could be a solving problem for nation states. Professor Vries, how do you see it?
Well, I chose for my presentation to start at least a little bit broader than just climate change, because I think we focus too much on climate change, and we tend to forget that we are now living in a world in which we have 8 billion people, which may grow to 10 billion people. We have an increasing inequality. We have increasing resentment in many places outside the Western world, at least in my own experience. And it means that we have to deal with a number of issues which for which climate change is just one additional stressor. And I think that's the proper framing of climate change for the moment. You can always start to discuss the real long term in which the whole planet will go down the drain, but I think that's not really so interesting. It's much more sensible to realize that billions of people live in situations which are pretty hard, if only because of the limits to growth situation in which their populations were growing to the present 8 billion. They face serious problems with food, with water, with energy. At the same time, partly because of ICT, which may resolve many problems, but also creates problems, they can now see, at least when I was traveling recently for a while in India, you can see it in the streets, everyone is watching on the screen how the rich people are living in their own country, but also elsewhere. Which means that we have a rising expectation, the so-called wave of rising expectations we were discussing in the 70s and the 80s, which is intensifying at the moment. This is the world in which many people live. So if we want to then deal with it in a fashion of, let's say, nation states becoming or preserving their sovereignty, nation states being secure, sustainable, etc., then I think all these global stories, the ones I also showed, are background narratives, because in the end, we are here and now and have to deal every day with a number of pressing problems. For many people, really pressing problems. Now, I disagree a little bit about eliminating or forgetting about the discussion about adaptation to climate change, in the sense that, in my experience, in the more urbanized areas in the world, there is hardly a sense of living in nature anymore left. There is a huge alienation in our big city centers of living with nature. And this is, I think, fairly disastrous, possibly. But I mentioned also some of the trends I can see which go in the right direction. And for me, the right direction is not particularly adapting to climate change, especially when it's sold very well by all types of companies. I now see on every product, I can see, okay, climate friendly, sustainable, green, bio, you name it. I mean, and then they also have in small letters how many liters of water they are saving, or you are saving, if you buy their product. To me, this is all really the side of, or in the periphery of what really matters, because what really matters is that we have to become more serious about these real world problems and then make sure that we deal with the local people or the regional people and their situations. And that's why I said that to me it's quite good, also speaking as a person in the academic world, that we now have more attention for something like common pool resources, which means that we acknowledge that a number of things in the world should not be privatized, should instead be appreciated and managed as something which we share as a common pool resource. I was always almost shocked to see that people like, let me just mention names, people like Musk and the Facebook people can launch 10,000 satellites without any discussion about the fact that the atmosphere is a global commons. No discussion about it. You just start doing it. And I'm happy that these new concepts, also put forward by people like Leonard Ostrom, that they come into the debate. The role of the state. In my country, I had experience for the last 30 years that we had a kind of, I would say, neo-capitalist or neoliberal wave in which it was officially said that the state should be reduced to its minimum functions, which usually is defense, protecting private property, and perhaps a few other functions. we are reorienting ourselves again to other roles for the state, because it starts to become clear that you cannot help also the local regional situation if you have not, at least for some issues, this larger level support. So this is at least something I would like to say about your question.
Thank you, Logan.
Well, with regards to the social and the economic aspect, the politicization of climate change is very pronounced back in my country, in America, where it is very clearly left-right issue. If you are green, then you must be a Democrat. If you're against it and you look at green as a job killer or just an effort to control society and people, then that's the line of the Republican. It's the right. And it's the danger of really not even discussing the issue at all, but rather just being a badge to show off which side of the aisle that you're on. With regards to, that's the social aspect. With regards to the economic aspect, there is a cost to all of this, to going green. One of the favored examples of this is the electric car, which is always propped up as one of the best tools to make yourself go green. Never mind where the energy to actually drive that car comes from. But even if that was taken at face value of the electric car, the average cost of a new car today in America, I'm just using the US as an example, is around 50 grand, 50,000 US dollars. If you want it to be an electric car, you probably have to tack on another 3,000 to 5,000. Most people cannot afford this. At that rate, you have to be making near a six-figure salary. So with regards to social and economic aspect, it's a question of how many people can actually afford to partake in this initiative. If you're looking at it from an aspect of not just government policy or building infrastructure, but everyday behaviors, especially with America, since we are a car country. We drive to get everywhere. So with regards to the social and the economic, if there's anything to learn from the U.S., it's to be careful not to frame it in the matter of if you're for it, you're good, and if you're against it, you're bad, rather than having it as a discussion, which is pretty much all but dead in the United States.
Yes, thank you. And I would also like to add that the gentlemen were from Netherlands and America, and the European Union also has ban on carbon diesel cars for 2035. And it's interesting because these are the most developed countries, and even they might not be able to afford it. So it might not be available to the lower income families, for example. And since we are talking about nation states, Professor Vries already mentioned that there are other nations who are even poorer than these countries. Then what can they do about the energy transition, the green agenda, the sustainable development? Callum?
So something that's implied in a lot of this, I think, is what I've noticed in the UK is that the climate movement, much like many other justice movements, are very much middle-class movements. They may be propagated by left-wing parties, which typically represented the interests of the working class, but in the UK at least, the left has been, I call it, ideologically gentrified. You know, when you have a city and you have middle-class people move into a working-class neighborhood and push them all out. The same has happened in our Labour Party. It's been gentrified by middle-class preoccupations. And it's interesting how if you go to a cafe where all the white-collar workers go for their coffee, as you noted, you'll have on all these items you buy, everything that went into this is sustainable, it's resourced properly, this is recycled paper for your takeaway Starbucks coffee. But what's really interesting about this, I think, is that it doesn't occur to anyone maybe just to make the coffee at home and carry a thermos, as you know my parents used to do. My dad used to go to work in the 80s. He'd always leave the house. He'd go, right, I've got my thermos, I can go. And he'd go to work with his thermos under his arm. Now today, you know, I go to Scruton, right? I don't bring a thermos to MCC. And so if I was trying to be sustainable, me being sustainable is not me getting a Scruton coffee in a recycled paper mug. It's me bringing a thermos. That's the real solution. And so my point in this is that, and another example of this is actually, you mentioned Elon Musk and cars. The really dumb thing about Elon Musk, like people say this guy's some genius, but the reason why he's titanically stupid or cynical is that he says the solution to transport, say in LA, is to dig tunnels to put cars in, which should be electric cars. But there's something else you could put in those tunnels. It's called a metro system. And it's really interesting how people think the solution to sustainable transport is to get an electric car. Well, maybe just develop some public infrastructure, you know, something like that, or ride a bicycle. And so it's really fascinating that, and my point in this is a deeper theme, which is that we have this tyranny of quantitative concerns, I think. Like, data is important, statistics is important, of course it is. But not all of our problems are best understood statistically. Not all of them are about the price of something. Something is sometimes about the value of something, which is more complex. And if you look at, for instance, how we think about all these examples I gave, is people say, okay, we can measure that this coffee cup is more sustainable than the last one. We can measure that this car emits fewer fumes than the previous type of car. We can measure that quantitatively. But what actually, where the solution I think lies, is the change of something qualitative, which is the values we have. If we can step away from the idea, if Americans, no offense to the Americans, can step away from the idea that their entire sense of identity and masculinity and status is to do with what your car is, and actually have something slightly less ostentatious, something slightly less performative, then maybe that's the solution. So it's interesting, we always think that the solution is in the price of something, that we must pay for our carbon offsets, but we never think about the value of something. And so it's very interesting for me, sometimes I feel the debate is conducted on it's not that the answers people give are wrong, the questions they're asking are wrong. It's not a question of what is the most efficient car. It's why are you driving a car? It's not what is the most sustainable coffee. It's why don't you just bring a thermos? And it's really interesting, it doesn't occur to us often because there's nothing in the culture telling us that we should take these other options. And I'm as bad as anyone else, I don't bring a thermos either. But I should. And so, and I think this goes as well for when we think about one last thing on this, is that I think in the framing of your question you said about the level of development, how sustainable is our level of development? Well, it's interesting that, because a level of development suggests that society is a series of levels that we progress through towards presumably some utopia or the end of the world. But there's an idea that it's a quantitative thing of more and more and more. But I don't think this is true. This modernist idea from the 1950s of Walt Rostow and the stages of growth and all this stuff, this idea that we're societies passing through levels of development to attain presumably 1950s American standards, that's when the book was written about this topic, it's missing the point. It's not that we are quantitatively moving through stages, that we have chosen a particular form of culture. So it's not that we are, if you look at American society, that is not a stage of development. It's a set of choices about what they value. It's a set of choices that's saying we value the material over, for instance, the spiritual maybe, or consumerism over anything else. And this is less a sort of like an empirical problem or a material problem than it is an ideological one. It's less an ideological one than it is an anthropological one. The problem is the form of culture we've chosen. It's not the stage of the culture we're at. In fact, the very concept that there are stages of culture is itself a cultural idea that is specific to certain cultures. So I think we need to get away from this, the framing we often have when we think about many issues, climate, environment, development, all these ideas. We have such a quantitative way of thinking about problems that are fundamentally human problems. And because they are human, they are qualitative problems before they are quantitative. I'm not saying stats don't matter, but I'm saying stats are not all that matters. And in fact, the stats are usually in service of something that matters far more, which are our values.
Thank you. Would you like to comment, Professor?
Well, yes, in response to what you are saying, I fully agree with this. And I think there are a number of examples in the Netherlands which show that we should not focus too much, at least, on quantifications and on technocratic or engineering solutions. And two examples in the Netherlands are interesting. We had a big flood in 1953. And then without any further big doubt or debate, we started to build what is called the Delta Works, which means that there were invested the equivalent of maybe 20, 30, 40 billion euros into protecting that part of the Netherlands. And this was a great success. And actually, slowly, this sense of societal functionality and solidarity is coming back. For example, in recent projects, in which we decided the way to deal with floods is not to build higher dikes, which was the usual solution, but instead give room to water. This is now the new key concept, mainly because we had so many ecologists who went beyond simple cost-benefit analysis that we now accepted these options. And I could give the same example about mobility. Mobility in the Netherlands is slowly changing, and I think this is true for many European cities, in the situation that you wonder, why are you actually displacing yourself all the time? And if you do so, sometimes a pedestrian way is the best. Bicycles are now by far the most important way of transporting yourself in the Netherlands. We have massive bicycle networks. The public transport system has invested so much that stations are now becoming center points in the city. If you had asked me 20 years ago, is this a profitable investment in all these stations, like in Utrecht or Amsterdam, would have been impossible to make a sensible cost-benefit analysis, because it turns out that these become nodes in the center. How do you quantify the economic value of having such a place?
Can I just throw something on to that? Implied in a lot of our discussion around environmental issues often is really a concern for risk. And something that's appeared since the 1990s is an assumption that there is a possible life out there. And I should say, what I'm about to say is going to sound absurd when I state it, but I think often it's implied in our discussions. Not this discussion, but often in society's discussions. There's a presumption that somehow there's a life out there that is free from risk. But in the same way that all political lives end in failure, all lives end in death, and life is indeed very risky. We all will go some way. And there is risk in life. And it's very interesting how in the past, we used to, like, if you go back 150 years, and I'm being a little bit flippant here when I say this, but if you went to a hospital and you survived, they would have to do an inquiry to work out how did you survive. But now, of course, if you go to the hospital and you die, that's when they do the inquiry. And it's interesting, in an age where risk was much more present in our lives, that's why we had theology, that's why we had such a strong religious culture, I think, often, because our risk was there. We felt we better pray properly to make sure that we avoid risk. And it's interesting, we've replaced in our age today theology with technocracy, because increasingly we've mitigated so many risks that we forget that life is still inherently risky. But my point of where I'm going with this is that if you have this idea that any type of risk is intolerable, you end up logically with what Japan have done since the earthquake, or the tsunami rather, in 2011. So I think we all remember the tsunami in Japan, the terrible images of that massive tsunami swamping whole villages. We all remember this. I don't know if anyone really knows what the Japanese have done since. That in the last 10 years, what they've done is their solution to the risk of tsunami, which they've lived with forever, their solution is across the bays of those villages, they have built 50-meter high concrete walls straight across the bay. It was worth Googling this, it's shocking. So entire fishing villages where there's an inlet, a beautiful inlet with a fishing village with a view of the sea, across the inlet, they've built these walls that are absolutely huge. Massive, massive concrete bunkers, cutting off the community from the sea, so all you can see is concrete, cutting off the fishermen from the sea, destroying the ecosystems, all because there may be another one at some point, which maybe flattens the village. But what they could have done is they could have created more space for it, or the culture could have adapted to the fact there is always this type of risk and we live with it, or improved the early warning systems. But it's interesting when risk is seen as politically intolerable, and often in a democracy it certainly can be intolerable, because it's the idea of the short-termism of politicians. They say, well, I don't want it to be on my watch when this happens. What did I do wrong? When we have a culture where we are litigious, where we bring the law down and sue people for every type of risk, you end up logically with what the Japanese have done. And if you haven't seen it, it's really worth looking at what they've done, because they've completely destroyed the east coast of their country because of this trauma of this tsunami. Anyway, I thought it was worth mentioning because it's interesting as a counterpoint to the Dutch approach.
Something I would like to add in terms of gradualism and adaptivity. You were mentioning earlier with regards to how do we frame the discussion, how we frame the question of, rather than with electric car, well, why have a car at all? This is where, at least in the case of the U.S., the discussion always grinds to a halt, because then it becomes a matter less of climate policy and then more like life control. This is the ultimate backlash that we always see every time when it comes to a question of why have a car or something similar. And this is ultimately what the conservatives will seize upon, was saying they want you to change your whole life around for the matter of climate change. This is where I would advise more of the gradual attitude, and where, ironically, to some degree, the Musk system actually makes some sense, in that rather than going straight from gas cars to electric trains or what have you, you meet it halfway with, say, electric car. Now, that's not going to be the most economic format, but what it does is it changes the collective idea and the collective consensus little by little, gradualism. In the case of how long it takes, we've seen it done by generation. What we've seen with a lot of millennials and a lot of Gen Z generation is that they are more accepting of the idea of public transportation, because, or at least remember, at least for America, it's always been majorly a car country. And it's pretty sad to see how a lot of public transportation is today. You go into DC and the metro is constantly under renovation or it needs fixing. There's always something wrong with the red line. But in terms of actually changing the conversation from what kind of car you have to why a car and not public transportation, you really have to do that gradualism in order for it to be effective. Otherwise, I would say not just for America, but really for just people in general, ask for a change too quickly and you won't make progress at all.
I just say, having watched the London Underground try and build one line over 20 years, there's no such thing as non-gradual infrastructure. But
Thank you for these answers. And you mentioned the technocracy as one of the problems, I think, Callum, or the way we are moving in how we are building our societies, and also in regard to sustainability. Well, 50 years ago was the Limits to Growth book published, which were already mentioned, and it basically aims to solve the planetary boundaries. And there is one point of it which mentions that technological solution would be applicable to solve some of these planetary boundaries. Do you agree with this, Professor Vries?
Well, I know in quite some detail the discussion about the planetary boundaries, and I was somewhat critical about the idea that you can, for example, somehow aggregate all the here and now existing problems with water into a single indicator, and then say it's red. It means we are beyond somehow. I mean, who's beyond? Where? For how long? And why? So I have some criticisms here. Apart from the fact that planetary boundaries and donut cakes can communicate certain things in this whole debate, I would say that the limits to growth discussion, the discourse, is more along the lines I suggested. That's why I suggested it, which means that we have to confront the mechanisms which push us for more and more growth in economic activity, and which also are still behind the growth in population. And it's obvious that these growth mechanisms will only push us further into problems with our resources and with our sinks. And if you acknowledge this, then the reasonable and rational solution is actually at every level to try to understand those mechanisms and see how we can change those. And that means that for each of the planetary boundaries, then you may have to do things which are specific, but I always emphasize that you also should try to see the thing in its integrative aspects and really try to deal with it in their interactions. We all know that the food, the water, and the energy issues, we call it the food, water, energy nexus in academic circles, are closely related at the local level, the regional level, and the global level. So the planetary boundary, yes, fine. But to me, the most interesting part of research, at least, or also the discourse, at least, is, okay, what are then the mechanisms behind this growth? And for example, what you're saying about the US, I have lived there some time, you're right. This is a car society. So simply assuming in the model, for example, that you can get away with a car is maybe an interesting model simulation, but totally unrealistic. The same is true, by the way, about a number of solutions for the climate, like we start to collect CO2 and store it underground. Okay, it's only one line in our computer model, and there you go, solve the problem. The reality is, of course, that you talk about billion tons of carbon to make really a sensible contribution if you continue to grow with your population and your economy. So that's why I'm a bit skeptical about, let's go in the discourse to the mechanism. And to me, that's why I mentioned these changes in paradigm. If we are able to have a sensible discourse on what it means if we go to something like post-growth economic, what does it mean? It somehow means that we no longer maybe give full-fledged room to advertising everything all over the place. I mean, I see young people now, also in Europe, but certainly in the US, who are really flooded with commercials already at a young age. This means that in terms of values, we are telling them everything is basically without bound. You just go for your personal desire and the system will provide. This is what we have to discuss, in my view.
Well, the issue, I think, especially with concepts of planetary boundaries, as Callum mentioned, 25 years ago, we didn't even have anything such as an environmental expert. And now, a quarter of a century later, we supposedly have it all figured out, where we can actually make a clinical diagnosis of we add one more pound of carbon and the planet will explode, or something along those lines. And rather than looking at it with just, it's clear, just pie charts and certain lines and graphs, it invites this thinking well of just simply cause and effect. If it gets to this level and we implement this policy, the danger will go down. And the reality is, society is a lot more complex than that. It's not something you can simply solve through clinical diagnosis or saying it's just a matter of sucking the carbon out of the air and putting it underground. Second of all, the carbon is going to come back. So looking at it just through the lens of do A and then B will happen is simplifying the problem too much and is more than likely just to make it worse than to actually make it better, in my opinion.
Thank you. Callum?
So it's interesting that the idea of limits or planetary limits is similar to the concepts like tipping point, which we hear a lot about with the climate debate. And again, they're very sort of statistical, very almost mechanical understandings of not only the climate, but also our relationship to the climate. And I think sometimes we misunderstand or we neglect in the contemporary culture where we have such reverence for science. And, we should have respect for science. Science is an extremely useful tool. Of course it is. But I think sometimes when you look at the climate debate, in my view, it's often informed less by a rich understanding of science as much as an impoverished understanding of ourselves. There's a failure to understand that you cannot model society just in a linear, mechanical way as if it's a billiard balls on a table. That the way we react to the planet, you can put the word limits on it if you want. I don't know how that is supposed to be determined in any particular sense, but if you're trying to say there is the environment and we can know that, let's give that and say, okay, fine, maybe you can know the planet. But that doesn't tell you anything about what you should do. One of the issues for me with the climate debate is the science, again, of climate is very good. But the question of what we do with that science, what we do with policy, is there's no consensus on that. That's precisely where there is good debate, and there should be debate, because friction is a dependable source of illumination. When we have two ideas and we rub them together, maybe we get some heat, we also get some light, maybe we work out what we want to do. And one other thing I just mentioned is that when we think about about planetary issues, and you just mentioned this before, but it's interesting. The planet has always been there, but a planetary frame of reference has not. A planetary frame of reference is an artifact. It is much of, I think, an artifact of the culture that talks about it as it is an analysis of the planet. So it's only really in the context of a globalized post-imperial world of where we have nation states everywhere. Bear in mind, the nation state, as we understand it today, grew out of 17th century Europe. It's a post-Westphalia concept. It went global through colonialism, and it is now, by analogy, the global sort of operating system of the world, or program of the world. If you think about, by analogy, if you've all got phones, Android or iPhone, but you're all using them to do different things. And the same way we have a global system of nation states, but they're all writing different political stories, right? But the point is they are mutually intelligible through the system. It's only in the context of a planet where every bit of square inch of territory, with a few exceptions that prove the rule, are all in the same system where they're mutually intelligible, all with embassies everywhere. And that's a very, very modern phenomenon. It's in the last 150 years, basically. Really, it's that recent, and more recent, arguably. And it's only when you have that global political frame of reference, plus the technology to measure these things, plus the communications technology to communicate all this technology, can we even have a global frame of reference on what we term the climate now. It would have been a meaningless concept, not just meaningless philosophically, but of no utility to anyone 150 years ago. And I just think it's worth noting that when we think about all of these issues, there is always a cultural context in which we're even having the discussion. It doesn't make the discussion invalid, but I think sometimes we need to recognize that implied in the discussion is a certain naivety, not about the climate, but about ourselves who are talking about it.
Thank you for these answers. And now I'm going to read out the questions which the audience has sent you in. And the first one is about nation states, more specifically. What is gained and what is lost when we prioritize climate change across nation-state policymaking? Who would like to go first? Callum?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think with that, this is one of the, so if you go back 30 years, there are many ways to express your concern for your context or nature or the environment, which, by the way, is very ambiguous as to what that means sometimes, because, I grew up in the Lake District in England. The Lake District is not a wild landscape. It's a very cultivated landscape with hundreds of years of sedimented culture and tradition around fell farming and so on. And there's a highland with uplands called the fells, actually, like Felvidig, and covered in sheep. And that's seen as a very natural landscape. If you read Wordsworth, that's what Wordsworth was writing about. It inspired the Romantic movement. If you read Beatrix Potter, it's based there. That is a natural landscape. But at the moment, under the climate framing, people are saying, well, in order to combat climate change, we need to reforest or rewild all of these areas, which would completely destroy what was often seen as an archetypal sort of natural environment. So I think that when we say what is gained and what is lost by privileging climate change, I think sometimes a lot of more local, granular, and ultimately more actionable things can be lost, or activities can be lost, when we reframe everything as the climate. And I think so. There's a kind of a danger to the climate framing. Sometimes it can defer to the decision makers, the experts somewhere, the UN maybe, who are going to decide something. And I think in a sense it's somewhat disempowering for people on the ground. Because, I have neighbors in England and they are really concerned about climate change, but they don't know anything about the local ecology. They absolutely know nothing about the local river, the fact the local river sediments up and it causes the river to move, which changes everything downstream. They're not going down and digging the river in their spare time. They're tweeting about the climate. It's not useful. And so climate, it has a utility, but it's not the only game in town. I think, and sometimes the climate narrative can be so dominant, other things are drowned out.
When it comes to the discussion of climate also, what I've noticed is that there seems to be a focus on trying to stop the Earth from changing, in a sense, is that it needs to be preserved in a perfect, pristine station, as if it were an artifact in a museum. And what people tend to forget is that Earth has always been changing throughout history. And as you said, the change happens right there on the ground, right in front of us, and people don't realize it. Climate change is not synonymous with disaster. We're not all going to die in a giant volcano or whatever the latest natural disaster movie is. The Earth is always changing, and humans are always adapting to it. So again, it comes back to that question of how we talk about climate change. And so in terms of prioritizing climate change, as you say, the focus of that usually seems to be how do we stop the climate from changing in some sense. So it goes back to that question of how are we framing the conversation.
Thank you. And you all mentioned that that the Western people who live in big cities might not be so focused on nature, and they are part of the climate activism, and they're very concerned about climate change. But how do you see what could be a solution for people like us living in Budapest? How could we be more involved in the climate change conversation, but in a practical, in a more environment truly friendly way?
Well, part of my answer would be that I'm trying to teach about sustainability to encourage young people to reflect on these questions and then make their own decisions. Because up to a point, it's obvious what you have to do, I think. If you live in cities, for example, there has been a gradual elimination of contact with nature. And this has been part even of our status, our ideas about the good life. Now, increasingly, you can see now that the rich start to buy second houses. They did already in the past. But now, of course, you buy a second house. And already in the Netherlands, 1 out of every 8 persons, I think, has a second house, either in the Netherlands or in the rest of Europe. So that's our connection with nature. And my guess is that most young people already envisage to have a house in the city, but of course also a house somewhere in rural areas. So this in itself is okay, I think, and it's part of what you were asking. But it's certainly not enough. I think I mentioned changing paradigms. I noticed, especially in conversations with biologists and ecologists, that we should have, and I see that this change is happening, a different view of nature. Even the very notion of evolution has badly interpreted around the 1900s as a survival of the fittest. And this largely served a certain competitive, industrializing lifestyle and society. But increasingly, ecologists are telling us, no, an ecosystem is not primarily something in which survival of the fittest is the key dynamic. Cooperation is maybe as important or more important than competition to maintain the integrity of the whole system. And I think, and that's the second, apart from having a second house in a rural area, a new, better idea about nature is also part of the answer to your question, in my view. And if you have this other idea of nature, you may also slowly start to reflect on, is it really, let's say, decent? Is it justifiable that we have in a country like the Netherlands, for example, some 6-7 million cows living in relatively bad situations? Is it justifiable in terms of animal welfare? Is it justifiable in terms of our relation with what we call other living beings? As you can sense, my answer is, well, maybe not. Maybe this is not the way to deal with other living beings and to deal with nature. And that would mean, if we accept this at a larger scale, that from a very relatively, or maybe much, destructive attitude towards non-human life, we slowly may develop a more cooperative and also emotionally more friendly relation with nature, with other species in nature. And I hope that this will evolve. In fact, if you look at the changes, it's not only some of the biologists and ecologists I know who point at this change, but also many people in cultural anthropology, for instance, who are rediscovering the wisdom of traditional cultures, of indigenous cultures, who actually did indeed adapt to changes for thousands of years, and sometimes now have the best natural solutions to things like changing climate or changing whatever. So that would be at least 2 ingredients of my answer, but you may add others.
Whatever side of the aisle you are on, in the case of America, or whatever your opinion is based on climate change, make sure choices you make are out of knowledge and not out of fear, because we've seen too often what happens with the latter. In the case of Europe, again, point to Germany, largely had energy independence thanks to nuclear energy, but fear of it drove them to shut them all down and become reliant on much more toxic fuel from Russia. In the case of ethanol, it was pushed for a long time as a solution to climate change. Later, they found out it was actually more poisonous to the environment, a lot more poisonous. A number of decades ago, the big fear was global cooling. And now that argument is all but gone. So the message of this is recognize what you do not know, and at the same time also recognize that this is a science and a realm of knowledge that is still developing. So whatever decisions made, do not make them out of emotion, make them out of actual knowledge. So whatever you plan to do, make sure you have the education to back it up with.
Thank you. And you also mentioned to the audience what is your message, your key takeaway. And I would also like to ask Callum and Dr. Vries to make a quick summary on what is your message to the audience. Callum?
Oh, well, I mean, I suppose, a more general point is that, the whole idea of, when Rome burns, it's not going to be from climate change. It's going to be, as it always was, from some sort of political conflict. And I do think the biggest conflicts, the biggest challenges we face in the world today are not the climate. I do think they're political, they're war and so on. I mean, we don't know what's around the bend next week, next month, next year, next decade. And I think we've become quite complacent in the last few decades, certainly speaking from the Anglosphere, this idea of the end of history, that everything was all just fine now, we're just calibrating the edges, smoothing everything over. I think climate has been one of those issues that we've now centered in our politics, but while we're doing that, the actual narrative around climate change is itself being used and abused politically by people with their own agendas, and often there's far more, I think, consequential issues for society than it. It's not to say climate doesn't matter, but I'm not sure in the hierarchy of concerns it's necessarily the strongest. But I also think in terms of getting away from, or what would be, what can people do on the ground, I do think that most activities in all areas of life are local. I mean, the things that often of most value are always the least glamorous. No one is, if you do something just, like most things in a local community, like unpaid and unglamorous, they're not necessarily fun. You don't look forward to it. I know in England, my dad occasionally goes and cuts the grass for the village, and he sits on a lot of incredibly boring meetings talking about details that no one really cares about, but they are the fabric of the local community. But he gives his time because he thinks it's the right thing to do. He doesn't enjoy it. He comes home and complains about it, but he does it. And I think that's one of the problems we have across certainly the Anglosphere these days is the decline of local communities, because we're such a atomized, selfish culture increasingly that no one wants to do these things. And I think this goes for all areas of life, including environmental concerns, picking up the litter or whatever it may be. I think we're too easily bewitched by the glamour of grand abstractions, but life is not always that glamorous. I tend to find things that are quite boring. It's like with food. The food that doesn't taste good is always best for you. And it's like that. Like most things in life that are actually really nutritious for the culture, say, are usually things that aren't that exciting. The problem with the climate is become extremely sexy right now, and that's not always, I don't think, a sign of it being the best way to spend our time.
Thank you, Dr. Bert De Vries. What is the key message for our audience?
Well, in about one sentence, I would say try to become a critical scientist and try to develop a sense of fairness and justice to guide your actions. And then whether the end result will be sustainable, I don't know.
Thank you so much for the distinguished panel members for this discussion. And thank you for the audience members for listening to us.
Köszönöm szépen.